War movies promise truth, but veterans know the difference between spectacle and survival. For those who lived it, the smallest detail rings louder than any explosion. This documentary examines 10 war films that angered, frustrated, or alienated real veterans, not because they lacked action, but because they replaced lived experience with fantasy distortion and emotional shortcuts. Number 10. Pearl Harbor, 2001. When Pearl Harbor premiered, it was marketed as a respectful memorial wrapped in blockbuster scale. Veterans who survived the actual attack felt something very different. Many described the film as emotionally manipulative and structurally dishonest. Instead of chaos, confusion, and terror, they saw polished heroics framed like a romance film with war as background decoration. Naval veterans were especially vocal about the air combat sequences, which ignored formation discipline, altitude logic, and basic defensive reality. The Japanese attack was not a cinematic dogfight. It was sudden, overwhelming, and brutally one-sided. Survivors recalled being targets, not participants, in choreographed hero moments. The movie turned panic into spectacle and loss into motivation for fictional characters. What upset veterans most was tone. Pearl Harbor did not feel like a tragedy unfolding in real time. It felt like a love story interrupted by history. Sailors and airmen who watched friends die felt the movie asked them to relive trauma while focusing attention elsewhere. Instead of honoring those who never left the harbor, the film lingered on melodrama and slow-motion fantasy. Many veterans walked out not angry, but disappointed. They did not expect perfect accuracy, but they expected gravity. Pearl Harbor replaced survivor testimony with cinematic excess. In doing so, it became a film remembered not for remembrance, but for missing the emotional truth of one of the most devastating mornings in American military history. Number 9. Rambo, First Blood, Part II, 1985. Vietnam veterans have long spoken about the damage done by Rambo Part II. While audiences cheered the film, many veterans felt it turned their war into a cartoon revenge fantasy. The movie presented Vietnam as a place where one man could fix history through violence and muscle. Veterans knew it did not work that way. Former POWs were especially critical. The film implied that prisoners were abandoned and could be rescued by sheer willpower. Veterans who endured captivity described a far harsher reality filled with isolation, illness, and long-term psychological damage. Rambo reduced that experience to an action montage that ignored suffering in favor of triumph. Combat veterans also objected to the portrayal of Vietnamese forces as faceless targets. Real soldiers remembered a complex war involving civilians, terrain fear, and moral ambiguity. Rambo offered none of that. It simplified the conflict into good and evil with explosions as punctuation. Many veterans felt it erased accountability and replaced reflection with fantasy. While some acknowledged the film expressed emotional anger, others felt it rewrote history to soothe national guilt. Veterans did not want reassurance. They wanted honesty. Rambo Part II became a symbol of how Hollywood tried to heal wounds by pretending they were never complicated to begin with. Number 8. The Green Berets, 1968. Released during the height of the Vietnam War, the Green Berets was embraced by politicians and rejected by many who served. Veterans criticized it almost immediately for presenting the war as clean, righteous, and strategically simple. Their experience was none of those things. Soldiers who returned from Vietnam described confusion, shifting objectives, and moral uncertainty. The film showed none of it. Instead, it offered a rigid good versus evil narrative that ignored civilian suffering and internal doubt. Veterans felt the movie spoke over them rather than listening. Combat tactics were another major issue. Veterans pointed out unrealistic patrol behavior, predictable enemy movement, and dialogue that felt more like propaganda than field communication. The jungle was not a stage, and soldiers were not symbols. For those who fought there, the film felt like a political statement disguised as a tribute. What hurt most was timing. While veterans were returning home injured, haunted, or uncertain, the Green Berets told audiences everything was justified and under control. Many felt erased by a version of the war that refused to acknowledge their lived reality. For them, the film was not offensive because it was patriotic, but because it denied truth. Number 7. U-571, 2000. Few war films angered veterans as quickly or as loudly as U-571. Allied naval veterans were stunned by its central premise, which credited American sailors with capturing a German Enigma machine at sea. Veterans knew the truth. British crews paid that price years earlier, and many died doing it. Royal Navy veterans called the film an erasure of sacrifice. They described friends lost in freezing water during desperate boarding actions that actually changed the course of the war. Seeing those events reassigned for cinematic convenience felt like a betrayal. American veterans also criticized the decision, noting that it placed entertainment above historical honesty. Submarine veterans further objected to the technical absurdities. Depth charge sequences ignored pressure physics, crew coordination, and damage control reality. The movie treated submarines like action vehicles rather than fragile steel coffins where one mistake meant death. Veterans described the experience as claustrophobic, silent and tense, not explosive and theatrical. What cut deepest was not one scene but the pattern. U-571 did not bend facts for clarity. It rewrote them for national heroism. Veterans across multiple countries felt their service was simplified into a fictional narrative that never needed to exist. The real story was already powerful enough. For many veterans, U-571 became an example of how war films can damage memory rather than preserve it. By changing who did what and why, the movie created resentment instead of respect. It reminded veterans that accuracy is not a detail. It is the foundation of remembrance. Number 6. Enemy at the Gates, 2001. Enemy at the Gates divided critics but united many Eastern Front veterans in frustration. Russian veterans in particular objected to the film's portrayal of the Red Army as a force driven primarily by fear and execution rather than discipline and sacrifice. Veterans acknowledged harsh conditions and brutal leadership during the war, but rejected the film's obsession with commissar executions. They argued that the movie reduced Soviet soldiers to victims of their own command structure rather than fighters resisting annihilation. This framing erased pride, resilience, and strategic competence. Sniper veterans also criticized the exaggerated cat-and-mouse narrative. Real sniper warfare involved patience, positioning, and silence over days or weeks. The film turned it into a theatrical duel built around dramatic confrontations. Veterans felt the tension was manufactured rather than earned. Perhaps most painful was how the film portrayed Stalingrad itself. Veterans remembered hunger, disease, and relentless attrition. Enemy at the Gates used suffering as atmosphere rather than consequence. It looked brutal but felt detached from the lived experience of survival. For many Russian veterans, the film did not insult them directly. It simply failed to understand them. By focusing on spectacle and Western narrative structure, it flattened one of history's most complex battles into a familiar story shape. Veterans who endured Stalingrad felt their endurance deserved more than symbolism. Number 5. Windtalkers, 2002. Windtalkers set out to honor Navajo Code talkers, but veterans felt the film lost its way. Navajo veterans were among the most vocal critics, arguing that the movie centered fictional violence over real achievement. The code itself became background noise to gunfire. Veterans emphasized that the code talkers were not expendable assets guarded by execution orders. They were trained, respected, and vital communicators whose success relied on trust. The film's suggestion that Marines might kill them to protect the code horrified those who served alongside them. Combat veterans also objected to exaggerated battlefield choreography. The Pacific War was brutal, exhausting, and chaotic. Windtalkers framed it as a series of action set pieces disconnected from logistical reality. Veterans felt the film replaced exhaustion with hero poses. What disappointed many was the missed opportunity. The true story of Navajo Code talkers was powerful enough without invention. Veterans wanted audiences to understand intelligence, warfare coordination, and cultural contribution. Instead, they got a generic war film wearing a real history as decoration. Windtalkers was not rejected because it tried to honor service. It was rejected because it did not trust that service to carry the story on its own. Number 4. Behind Enemy Lines, 2001. Behind Enemy Lines frustrated many modern service members because it presented combat as a solo survival spectacle. Naval aviators and special operations veterans described the film as a fantasy that ignored how modern militaries actually function. No pilot operates alone, and no extraction depends on one man improvising through enemy territory. Veterans objected to the way command structure was portrayed. Orders were ignored, consequences vanished, and chain of command existed only when convenient for drama. Real veterans emphasized that discipline and coordination are what keep people alive. The film suggested heroism comes from disobedience rather than preparation. Survival sequences also drew criticism. Veterans described the terrain navigation weapons handling and evasion tactics as implausible. Movement felt designed for the camera rather than survival. Real evasion is slow, cautious, and exhausting. The film treated it like a chase sequence. What angered many was the political framing. Veterans felt the movie simplified international conflict into a personal vendetta narrative. War became a backdrop for individual revenge rather than collective responsibility. For those who served in modern conflicts, the film ignored the emotional weight of rules engagement and collateral risk. Behind Enemy Lines did not offend because it was fictional. It offended because it claimed realism while rejecting reality. Veterans felt it trained audiences to misunderstand modern warfare and overestimate individual power. In doing so, it replaced truth with spectacle. Number 3. Inchon, 1981. Inchon baffled veterans with its grand scale and empty understanding. Military advisors reportedly walked away during production, and veterans later explained why. The film portrayed command decisions as simplistic and battlefield movement as ceremonial rather than tactical. Korean War veterans criticized the depiction of amphibious assault. Inchon landing was risky, complex, and nearly catastrophic. The film turned it into a clean, symbolic victory. Veterans remembered confusion, miscommunication, and fear. None of that made it on screen. Dialogue also rang false. Officers spoke in speeches, not orders. Soldiers responded like extras, not exhausted men under fire. Veterans described the experience as watching a pageant rather than a battle. War does not pause for philosophy. What truly alienated veterans was the absence of consequence. Losses felt abstract. Deaths lacked weight. The film seemed more interested in ideology than humanity. Veterans felt used rather than represented. Inchon stands as a lesson in how scale cannot replace understanding. Veterans do not need perfection. They need sincerity. This film offered neither. Number 2. Heartbreak Ridge, 1986. Heartbreak Ridge is often remembered as a tough-talking military film, but many Marines saw something very different. To them, it felt like a caricature of Marine culture frozen in an outdated image that never truly existed. Veterans who served before and after the era depicted argued that the film confused discipline with humiliation and leadership with intimidation. Marine instructors pushed recruits hard, but purpose always mattered. Training was brutal because survival demanded it. In the film, cruelty often appeared disconnected from instruction. Veterans felt the message suggested Marines were shaped through punishment alone rather than through responsibility, teamwork, and earned respect. That portrayal frustrated those who remembered mentors, not tyrants. The Grenada sequences deepened veteran criticism. Marines who participated in real operations pointed out how coordination errors were treated as jokes rather than life-threatening failures. Communication breakdowns were simplified for laughs, and command decisions felt improvised rather than calculated. Veterans knew such chaos cost lives. What troubled many was how the film reinforced stereotypes already misunderstood by civilians. Marines were shown as reckless, undisciplined, and motivated by ego. Veterans felt this erased professionalism, preparation, and restraint. The Marine Corps was not built on insults. It was built on trust forged under pressure. Some veterans admitted enjoying the film as entertainment. Others rejected it completely, but even those who liked it acknowledged it did not reflect their service. Heartbreak Ridge wanted to mythologize toughness. Veterans wanted accuracy, dignity, and recognition of the responsibility carried with every order given and followed. Number 1. The Thin Red Line, 1998. The Thin Red Line is often praised as poetic and philosophical, but many combat veterans struggled to connect with it. While critics admired its meditation on nature and mortality, veterans described a film that felt detached from the lived experience of battle. To them, war was not quiet reflection. It was chaos, noise, confusion, and fear. Veterans who fought described combat as overwhelming. Decisions happened in seconds, not monologues. Survival depended on instinct, not introspection. The film slowed everything down, allowing characters to think while bullets flew. Veterans said that luxury does not exist in real combat. Voice-over narration became a major point of contention. Veterans felt inner thoughts replaced physical reaction. Instead of adrenaline, panic, and urgency, the film offered contemplation. Many felt the narration softened trauma by intellectualizing it. War did not feel philosophical to those inside it. It felt immediate, brutal, and relentless. Battle sequences also frustrated veterans. While visually striking, they lacked urgency. Explosions felt distant. Death felt symbolic. Veterans remembered screaming confusion and disorientation. The film portrayed loss as abstract rather than personal. Some veterans respected the film's intention. They acknowledged it tried to explore emotional aftermath rather than tactics. But many felt it misunderstood the moment itself. Reflection comes later. During combat, there is only action and survival. For these veterans, the Thin Red Line was not offensive. It was alienating. It spoke about war without truly inhabiting it. And for those who lived it, that distance mattered more than beauty. Veterans do not demand perfection from war movies. They demand respect. These films failed not because they lacked action, but because they misunderstood experience. War leaves marks that cannot be stylized away. When movies forget that truth, veterans notice immediately, and they never forget it.